American operations in Vietnam.
Just the name of it evokes all sorts of horrible images. Agent Orange.
November 14th, 1965.
From eerie encounters in the dense jungles to unusual experiments that defy explanation, the Vietnam War was shrouded in a darkness far beyond what was shown on the evening news. The war, often remembered for its intense battles and political turmoil, has secrets that have remained hidden for decades. Join us as we delve into the spine-tingling stories and unsettling truths that were buried deep within the war's shadows. Ghouls in the jungle. During the Vietnam War, the dense jungles of Vietnam were not only a physical battleground but also a psychological one. The U.S. Marines often sought out local guides to help them navigate the unfamiliar and treacherous terrain. However, in some areas, the locals refused to venture into the deepest parts of the jungle. They warned the Marines of the Ma, phantoms that haunted the dense forest, a belief deeply ingrained in Vietnamese folklore. These spirits were said to be the souls of the dead, restless and angry, lurking in the shadows of the jungle. The locals feared these spirits more than they feared the war itself, and their warnings left an indelible mark on the American troops. The Marines, initially dismissive of these superstitions, soon found themselves in the midst of something far more unnerving than they had anticipated. Beginning in 1965, reports began to emerge from the jungles of Vietnam that sent chills down the spines of even the most battle-hardened soldiers. Troops began witnessing ghostly figures gliding through the trees with an eerie, supernatural grace. These apparitions were not bound by the laws of the living, seemingly able to move through the jungle without a sound, their presence both terrifying and inexplicable. The fear escalated as soldiers started encountering more sinister beings, fanged creatures with pitch-black eyes that would attempt to abduct and devour unwary troops. These creatures, when confronted, seemed impervious to bullets, their bodies seemingly invulnerable to the weapons of war. As these sightings became more frequent, the line between myth and reality blurred, and the psychological toll on the soldiers grew. The jungle itself seemed to conspire with these phantoms. The triple canopy of trees blocked out the sunlight, creating a perpetual twilight that only heightened the soldiers' fear. Day and night lost meaning in this shadowy world where the dead appeared to walk among the living. The relentless pressure of fighting an enemy they couldn't understand, both human and supernatural, began to wear down the morale of the American forces. In response, the military's top brass devised a plan to eliminate the source of these fears. By stripping the jungle of its dense foliage, the military hoped to drive out the ghosts and phantoms that haunted their troops. Once the jungle was laid bare, the Marines moved in with flamethrowers, incinerating anything that remained. This strategy was as much about reclaiming the psychological upper hand as it was about gaining a tactical advantage. By eradicating the jungle, they sought to erase the terrifying presence that had shaken their troops to the core. Operation Wandering Soul, as this psychological warfare campaign came to be known, exploited the deep-seated fears of the Vietnamese people, while also addressing the very real terror experienced by American soldiers. Hooch maids. The Vietnam War was a complex and brutal conflict, and within its chaos, the lives of countless women were caught up in the maelstrom. Among these were the hooch maids, a group of women who became entwined with American soldiers. Hooch maids were Vietnamese women who worked in American military camps, performing domestic chores like cleaning, laundry, and cooking. The term hooch referred to the makeshift huts or barracks where soldiers lived, and these women were a common sight in the camps. Many hooch maids were from rural areas, driven by poverty to seek work wherever they could find it, even in the heart of a war zone. For them, this work was a lifeline, providing a small income to support their families in an economy devastated by war. However, their presence in the camps often led to complicated and sometimes exploitative relationships with the soldiers. In a war where loneliness, fear, and the constant threat of death loomed large, emotional connections between hooch maids and soldiers were not uncommon. Some soldiers saw these women as a comfort, a fleeting connection to a sense of normalcy amid the chaos. Yet these relationships were rarely equal. The power dynamics were skewed, with the soldiers holding the upper hand, both socially and economically. Some hooch maids found themselves coerced into providing more than just domestic services, blurring the lines between maid and mistress. As American forces withdrew from Vietnam, countless hooch maids were left behind, often facing stigma and retribution from their own communities. They were seen as collaborators or traitors, having fraternized with the enemy. For those who bore children with American soldiers, the aftermath was even more painful. These children, often called Amerasians, were ostracized, bearing the visible impact of the war and the complex, often painful relationships that defined their existence. Rock apes. During the Vietnam War, reports of mysterious ape-like creatures known as rock apes emerged from the dense jungles of Vietnam, stirring both intrigue and fear among U.S. soldiers stationed in the region. These enigmatic beings, described by soldiers as large, hairy, and resembling primates, became the subject of numerous reports and rumors, fueling speculation about their nature and origin. The rock apes, or Yeti, as some soldiers called them, were first mentioned in the late 1960s. According to accounts from soldiers, these creatures were observed primarily in the areas of Quang Tri Province and the A Shao Valley, regions known for their dense, impenetrable jungle. Witnesses described the rock apes as being roughly 6 to 8 feet tall, with muscular builds covered in dark fur. Their appearance was said to be similar to that of apes or gorillas, though they were noted for their ability to move swiftly through the trees and jungles. Soldiers who reported encounters with the rock apes often described eerie and unsettling experiences. Some accounts spoke of hearing loud, guttural growls and screams that were unlike anything they had heard from known wildlife. In other instances, soldiers reported seeing these creatures in the shadows or briefly catching sight of them before they disappeared into the forest. These encounters were frequently accompanied by unexplained disturbances in the jungle, such as large footprints and broken vegetation. The fascination with the rock apes grew as soldiers shared their stories, leading to a variety of theories about their origins. Some believed that the creatures were an undiscovered species of primate, possibly a relic from prehistoric times. Others speculated that the rock apes were simply a figment of soldiers' imagination, driven by stress and the surreal nature of combat. There were even suggestions that the creatures might have been a form of psychological warfare, intended to unsettle troops by exploiting their fear of the unknown. The U.S. military conducted investigations into these reports, but no conclusive evidence of the rock apes' existence was ever found. The lack of physical evidence, combined with the challenging conditions of the jungle and the psychological strain of war, led many to dismiss the sightings as a combination of misidentifications of known animals and the effects of stress and fatigue. Despite the lack of concrete evidence, the legend of the rock apes persisted among veterans and has become a part of Vietnam War folklore. The mystery surrounding these creatures reflects the broader uncertainties and fears faced by soldiers in one of the war's most challenging environments. Agent Orange's dark legacy. Agent Orange, a potent herbicide used extensively during the Vietnam War, has left a dark and enduring legacy marked by severe health impacts on both soldiers and civilians. Its story begins in the early 1960s, when the U.S. military sought to eliminate dense jungle cover used by North Vietnamese forces and Viet Cong guerrillas. Agent Orange was part of a larger program called Operation Ranch Hand, which involved the aerial spraying of defoliants to reduce foliage and deny cover to enemy troops. Agent Orange contained a highly toxic compound known as dioxin, specifically TCDD, one of the most harmful chemicals ever produced. Its widespread use had devastating consequences, far beyond its intended military objectives. By the end of the war, approximately 19 million gallons of herbicides had been sprayed over Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The immediate effects of Agent Orange on the environment were severe. The chemical stripped large areas of vegetation, leading to soil erosion and the destruction of ecosystems. However, the more insidious impact was on human health. Soldiers who were exposed to Agent Orange experienced a range of health problems, including cancers, respiratory disorders, and skin diseases. The dioxin in Agent Orange is a known carcinogen, and studies have linked its exposure to several types of cancer, including leukemia, lymphoma, and prostate cancer. Civilians in affected regions faced even graver consequences. Millions of Vietnamese, Laotians, and Cambodians were exposed to the herbicide, and many of these individuals developed serious health conditions. The most tragic legacy of Agent Orange has been its impact on future generations. The chemical caused severe birth defects, including spina bifida, cleft palates, and limb deformities, which continue to affect the descendants of those exposed. The U.S. government initially denied responsibility for the long-term effects of Agent Orange, but over time, evidence mounted showing the widespread harm caused by the chemical. In the 1980s and 1990s, veterans organizations and advocacy groups pushed for recognition and compensation for those affected. The Veterans Administration began to acknowledge the links between Agent Orange and various health conditions, leading to compensation for affected veterans. Efforts to address the legacy of Agent Orange continue today. The U.S. and Vietnamese governments, along with various non-governmental organizations, have undertaken projects to clean up contaminated sites and provide medical assistance to affected individuals. Operation Delirium.
You feel the effects of the agent?
Everything's moving.
At an Army research facility, a soldier under the influence of a powerful mind-altering drug uttered, "I feel like my life is not worth a nickel here." This unsettling statement reveals a dark chapter of Cold War experimentation led by Colonel James S. Ketchum, whose work echoed through the corridors of military strategy during the Vietnam War. Ketchum, who served from 1956 and 1976, never saw combat in Vietnam, but was deeply involved in a secret program to develop psychochemical weapons aimed at incapacitating enemies without lethal force. Ketchum's ambitious vision was to create a new kind of warfare where chemical agents could temporarily disable opponents, causing what one officer described as a selective malfunctioning of the human machine. Starting in the 1960s, at the Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland, Ketchum led experiments that tested a range of chemical agents on soldiers, including LSD, BZ, and other psychotropics. The aim was to develop non-lethal weapons that could create chaos and confusion, potentially useful in the dense jungles of Vietnam, where traditional combat was grueling and unpredictable. The substances tested were designed to induce extreme delirium, hallucinations, and paranoia. Soldiers were given these chemicals without full knowledge of what they were taking or its effects, leading to terrifying experiences and severe psychological distress. While the experiments were intended to explore how such agents could be used to incapacitate enemy forces, they also highlighted the ethical and human cost of such research. During the Vietnam War, the U.S. military's interest in psychological and chemical warfare was evident in other operations. For example, Operation Wandering Soul exploited local superstitions to induce fear and confusion among Viet Cong forces. While Operation Delirium was not directly used in Vietnam, the era's broader experimentation with chemical and psychological tactics reflected a disturbing willingness to push ethical boundaries in the pursuit of military advantage. As the war progressed, the relevance of Ketchum's research became evident in the broader context of U.S. military strategies. The Vietnam War saw the extensive use of chemical agents like Agent Orange, intended to defoliate jungles and deny cover to enemy forces. This use of chemicals had devastating long-term effects on both the environment and human health, mirroring the ethical concerns raised by Ketchum's experiments. Ketchum, now retired, continues to defend his work, arguing that non-lethal chemical weapons could have prevented greater casualties. However, the legacy of these experiments remains controversial, highlighting the dark side of military innovation, where the quest for tactical advantage often overshadows human rights and ethical considerations. Operation Popeye. Operation Popeye was a highly secretive U.S. military program during the Vietnam War that sought to alter the weather to gain a tactical advantage. Initiated in 1967, the operation aimed to disrupt enemy supply lines and logistical support by inducing heavy rainfall over key areas of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a crucial supply route used by North Vietnamese forces to transport troops and supplies from North Vietnam through Laos and Cambodia. The operation was a part of a broader strategy of psychological and environmental warfare. The idea was to use cloud seeding, a technique that involves dispersing substances like silver iodide or sodium chloride into clouds to encourage precipitation, to create flooding and mudslides. These weather modifications were intended to make the trail impassable and slow down the enemy's movement, thereby disrupting their operations. The program was shrouded in secrecy, and its existence remained classified for years. The decision to use weather modification as a weapon was driven by the need to address the difficulties faced by US and Allied forces in the dense jungle and mountainous terrain of Southeast Asia. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was notorious for its strategic importance and its resilience despite extensive bombing campaigns. The US military sought to leverage weather modification as a means to gain an upper hand. Operation Popeye utilized aircraft equipped with cloud seeding equipment to disperse chemicals into clouds over the trail. The goal was to extend the monsoon season and increase rainfall, thereby causing extensive flooding and landslides. The operation was conducted primarily in Laos, where the Ho Chi Minh Trail was most heavily used. The program's results were mixed. While Operation Popeye did lead to increased rainfall in some areas, the overall impact on the Ho Chi Minh Trail was less significant than hoped. The North Vietnamese adapted to the weather conditions, and the trail's resilience continued despite the efforts to disrupt it. The operation was officially declassified in the early 1970s, and its revelation led to significant controversy. The ethical implications of manipulating weather patterns as a form of warfare raised concerns among scientists, environmentalists, and policymakers. The program was criticized for its potential environmental impact and its use of technology in warfare. Project 100,000. Project 100,000 was a controversial U.S. military recruitment program that operated during the Vietnam War, fundamentally altering the landscape of military service. Initiated in 1966 by Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, the project was a response to a growing need for soldiers amidst the escalating conflict in Vietnam. The program aimed to recruit an additional 100,000 soldiers by lowering the standards for enlistment, a move that would have profound and troubling consequences. The core of Project 100,000 was its relaxed eligibility criteria. Previously, the military had stringent requirements for enlistment, including educational, physical, and mental standards. However, to address the manpower shortages, the program dramatically reduced these requirements, allowing individuals who were previously deemed unfit for service, often due to low IQ scores or other disqualifying factors, to join the armed forces. This decision was driven by the urgent need to replenish troop numbers and sustain the Vietnam War effort. Under Project 100,000, recruits who might have been rejected under normal circumstances were now admitted. This included individuals with lower educational backgrounds and those with mental health issues or developmental disabilities. The program's proponents argued that it provided a path to opportunity for those who might otherwise have limited prospects, but it also led to a series of unintended and tragic outcomes. One of the most significant problems was the impact on the effectiveness of the troops. The recruits admitted under Project 100,000 often struggled with the demands of military training and combat. Their lower cognitive and physical abilities made them less capable of handling the complex and dangerous tasks required in Vietnam. This disparity contributed to higher casualty rates among these soldiers, who were more likely to suffer injuries or death compared to their peers. The program also had a notable impact on the morale and cohesion of military units. The integration of underqualified soldiers created tension and resentment within units, where more experienced and capable soldiers were often frustrated by the additional burden of working alongside individuals who struggled to meet the demands of combat. This situation sometimes led to a breakdown in unit effectiveness and contributed to a less disciplined and less effective fighting force. The program was criticized for exploiting vulnerable individuals and placing them in harm's way without adequate preparation or support. Many of these recruits were promised opportunities and benefits, but instead faced harsh realities and limited prospects after their service. By 1971, Project 100,000 was officially terminated as the military reassessed its recruitment strategies and sought to address the issues that had arisen. The program's impact on the lives of those who served, along with its influence on military policy, highlights the complex and often troubling nature of wartime decision-making and its long-lasting effects on both individuals and institutions. All right, guys, it's time for our subscribers' pick. This set of women you're looking at in this image were referred to as war concubines. These were Vietnamese women who became involved with American soldiers on a more permanent basis, often living with them as de facto partners. Some of these relationships were consensual, born out of mutual affection or convenience, while others were rooted in desperation or coercion. War concubines were often seen as preferable to hooch maids due to their perceived loyalty and intimate relationships with soldiers, which could foster better morale and personal support. For some women, becoming a war concubine was a survival strategy, offering protection and resources in a dangerous and uncertain world. But do you think there was a really big difference between the war concubines and hooch maids? Share your opinions in the comments section. William Curry. William Curry, a relatively lesser-known figure in the context of the Vietnam War, was a U.S. Army officer whose story became notable for its tragic outcome and the broader implications for military discipline and conduct during the conflict. Born in the United States in the early 1940s, Curry's service in Vietnam would come to symbolize the extreme pressures faced by soldiers and the tragic consequences of wartime decisions. Curry served as a lieutenant in the U.S. Army during the Vietnam War. In the midst of these challenges, Curry's service was notable for its unfortunate conclusion, which would eventually attract attention for its impact on both military personnel and public perception of the war. In early 1968, during the Tet Offensive, a major North Vietnamese military campaign that aimed to strike South Vietnamese and U.S. forces across the country, Curry was involved in a series of incidents that would ultimately lead to a court-martial. The Tet Offensive, which began on January 30th, 1968, was a coordinated series of attacks that shocked U.S. and South Vietnamese forces, significantly impacting morale and public opinion about the war. During this tumultuous period, Curry was assigned to a unit stationed in an area that faced significant insurgent activity. In the chaos of combat operations, Curry and his unit were involved in multiple skirmishes with Viet Cong forces. Reports indicate that, under the stress of combat and the pressures of the offensive, Curry made decisions that would later be scrutinized for their legality and ethics. The circumstances surrounding Curry's court-martial centered on allegations of misconduct and abuse of power. Specifically, he faced charges related to his treatment of prisoners and civilian populations, reflecting broader issues of military discipline and the conduct of U.S. forces in Vietnam. The complexities of these allegations were compounded by the intense operational environment and the often blurred lines between combat operations and civilian interactions. William Curry's court-martial and subsequent conviction brought to light the difficult ethical dilemmas faced by soldiers in Vietnam. His case highlighted the broader challenges of maintaining military discipline and adhering to the rules of engagement in a war characterized by irregular tactics and civilian involvement. Nguyen Ngoc Loan. Nguyen Ngoc Loan, a South Vietnamese police officer and general, is a figure whose controversial actions during the Vietnam War have left a lasting mark on history. Born in 1938 in Vietnam, Loan's career and legacy became infamous due to a single shocking moment captured in a photograph that would come to symbolize the brutal realities of the conflict. Loan was a prominent figure in the South Vietnamese military and police forces. As the chief of the national police, he wielded significant authority during the war, a period characterized by intense internal conflict and external aggression. His role was crucial in combating the Viet Cong insurgents and maintaining order in a war-torn nation. The pivotal moment that defined Loan's legacy occurred on February 1, 1968, during the Tet Offensive, a major campaign by the North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong that targeted South Vietnamese and American positions across the country. On this day, an event unfolded that would be forever etched in the annals of wartime history. The iconic and disturbing photograph shows Nguyen Ngoc Loan executing a Viet Cong prisoner on a Saigon street. The image, captured by Associated Press photographer Eddie Adams, depicts Loan, in uniform, shooting the prisoner in the head at point-blank range. This moment was part of a larger series of violent encounters that occurred during the Tet Offensive. The photograph, published widely around the world, sparked outrage and became a powerful symbol of the brutality of the Vietnam War. It drew significant criticism and scrutiny toward the conduct of South Vietnamese forces and the broader U.S. military involvement in the conflict. The image of Loan's execution vividly illustrated the harsh and often indiscriminate nature of the war, contributing to the growing anti-war sentiment both in the United States and internationally. Nguyen Ngoc Loan defended his actions by arguing that the prisoner was a known Viet Cong operative who had been responsible for numerous acts of violence against civilians and military personnel. Loan claimed that his decision to execute the prisoner was a necessary measure to prevent further atrocities and to maintain control in a chaotic situation. Nevertheless, the photograph and subsequent media coverage painted a more complex and morally ambiguous picture of the conflict. After the fall of Saigon in 1975, Nguyen Ngoc Loan fled to the United States, where he lived in exile. He faced ongoing criticism and was often regarded as a controversial figure due to the infamous photograph. Despite his attempts to rebuild his life and defend his actions, the lasting impact of the photograph overshadowed his contributions and role in the war. Loan passed away in 1998, leaving behind a legacy that is both contentious and deeply tied to the larger narrative of the Vietnam War. Tony Poe. Tony Poe, born Charles W. Tony Poe in 1929, was a significant and controversial figure during the Vietnam War. Known for his unconventional methods and tactics, Poe's career as a covert operative and military advisor has left a lasting impact on the history of U.S. military operations in Southeast Asia. Poe's involvement in the Vietnam War began after a distinguished career in the U.S. Army, where he served in various roles and earned a reputation for his expertise in unconventional warfare. By the early 1960s, he was recruited by the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, to assist with operations in Laos and Vietnam, where his experience and skills in guerrilla warfare made him a valuable asset. One of Poe's primary responsibilities was working with the Hmong people in Laos. The Hmong, an ethnic minority group, were recruited by the CIA to fight against the North Vietnamese forces and the Pathet Lao, a communist movement in Laos. Poe was tasked with training and advising these local forces, leveraging his knowledge of guerrilla tactics and his understanding of the region's complex political and cultural landscape. Poe's methods were often unorthodox and controversial. He was known for his aggressive tactics and his willingness to employ psychological and unconventional warfare techniques. These methods included the use of psychological operations to undermine enemy morale and the application of brutal tactics to achieve strategic objectives. Poe's approach was designed to maximize the effectiveness of his operations, but often drew criticism for its harshness and ethical implications. One of the most notable aspects of Poe's career was his role in the so-called secret war in Laos. This covert conflict, largely conducted behind the scenes, was a critical component of the broader Vietnam War effort. Poe's operations in Laos were part of a larger strategy to disrupt North Vietnamese supply lines and support the broader U.S. military objectives in the region. His efforts were instrumental in shaping the course of the conflict in Laos, although they also highlighted the moral complexities and challenges of covert warfare. Poe's reputation was further complicated by allegations of human rights abuses and war crimes. Critics argued that his tactics, while effective in some respects, often involved significant collateral damage and contributed to the suffering of civilians. These controversies have fueled ongoing debates about the ethical implications of unconventional warfare and the conduct of covert operations during the Vietnam War. After the war, Poe's activities remained largely classified, and he lived a relatively low-profile life until his death in 2011. And that's all for today. Thanks for watching.